Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. Today, we'll be discussing the Trump administration's recent equity deal with Intel and several developments around Nvidia's chip strategy in China. As always, I'm Brielle Hill, joined today by Greg Allen. Welcome, Greg.
Hello.
All right, well, let's jump into another chips episode. Everyone's super excited. We're going to start off with Intel. So during an August 22nd press conference, Trump announced the U.S. government would take a 9.9% stake in the semiconductor company, just a few weeks after Trump called on Intel's CEO to resign. Talk me through this. What exactly did the U.S. and Intel agree to in this deal, and how did they get there?
So it's a pretty big milestone when you think about it, to distinguish between what the Trump administration here is doing here and what the Biden administration was doing. So if you think about the CHIPS Act, the Biden administration's flagship chip industrial policy, those were grants and subsidies, and they were tied to the performance of milestones. So it's not like the companies just got the giant pile of money and then could just return that to their shareholders in the form of a dividend or a stock buyback. They were supposed to do specific things. And Intel, as the most prominent American chip manufacturer and one of the most prominent American chip designers, was obviously a big recipient of CHIPS Act money. And what the Trump administration has done here is they've acknowledged the reality that Intel is no longer going to hit some of the milestones that were part of their CHIPS Act funding agreement. To give you just one example, one of those milestones was that they had to create 3,000 jobs in the United States, most of which was tied to the construction of a new chip production facility in Ohio. That's not going to happen anymore. And that was already not going to happen before the Trump administration made this move. So there's a little bit of truth to, and you know, how those milestones were going to be renegotiated, what that would entail, you know, for the Intel leadership and for Trump and the US government. That was all sort of unclear. Well, now we have clarity, and what is going to happen is that Intel is going to continue receiving that money. But instead of that money being in the form of a grant tied to the performance of milestones, that money will instead take the form of an equity purchase agreement. So the U.S. government is going to buy, as you said, Brielle, 9.9% of the company. This is a big deal, and it's a big deal politically, and it's a big deal in terms of what it means for the future of U.S. industrial policy. If you think about the Republican Party in the presidency of Ronald Reagan, that was the era of privatization to the extent that the United States had government equity stakes in various industries, trying to unwind a lot of that. This was also the era of Margaret Thatcher in the UK, where she privatized a huge number of state-owned assets in the United Kingdom. Well, Trump, even though he's a member of the Republican Party, is actually, to a certain extent, reversing that trend. He is taking an equity stake in a company. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, right? There's a lot of conservatives who are up in arms over this policy, which we'll talk about in a bit here, because they see it as, you know, going counter to their pro-free market principles. But fundamentally, this deal is about ensuring, I think it's fair to say, that U.S. strategic interests are protected in the face of a very troubled Intel. And Intel has had a lot of problems. If you go back to the 1990s, Intel was the darling of Silicon Valley. It was the largest producer of chips in the world by revenue, and it also had the most advanced chip-making technology and set the standard for the whole industry. Now, the most advanced technology and most of the standard setting is being done by TSMC of Taiwan on the chip manufacturing side. And even on the chip design side, Intel is having problems, even though that's still a very big and successful business, especially in the data center part of the market. But it's facing a lot of threats. Apple, for example, is designing their own chips that are going in their PCs and getting great reviews. AMD and others are encroaching on Intel's business in PC and laptop. And Intel has never had a big share of the mobile market, where TSMC and others have really been at the forefront for a very long time on both the design side and on the manufacturing side. So Intel had a plan to, sort of get back into the leadership position in both chip manufacturing and in chip design, but it wasn't going well, even with the CHIPS Act subsidies. And I think one thing that's worth pointing out here is that Intel had a CEO shift in December 2024. Pat Gelsinger, who had been the CEO for almost all of the Biden administration, left. He was fired by the board, and a new individual, Lip-Bu Tan, was brought in by the board. And if you look at some of the quotes that came out of his Q2, second quarter 2025 earnings call transcript, there's some really interesting stuff that he had said that, just shows how much thinking had changed. And so here's one quote in particular from that earnings call that I think is particularly juicy. Up to and through Intel 18A, we could generate a reasonable return on our investments with only Intel products. The increase in capital cost at Intel 14A make it clear that we need both Intel products and a meaningful external customer to drive acceptable returns on our deployed capital, and I will only invest when I'm confident those returns exist. And that announcement, where he said basically, it used to be the case that Intel being its own customer, aka the Intel design business being the customer of the Intel chip manufacturing business, was enough that they could justify the jaw-dropping amount of money that it costs to stay at the leading edge of chip manufacturing technology. And he's saying that's just no longer true. If we don't have meaningful external customers, that's not going to make sense. But he also said that he was canceling a bunch of investments in chip manufacturing capacity, saying that he, quote, did not believe in a build it and they will come, if you build it, they will come strategy. So he's basically saying Gelsinger wanted to build all this fab capacity, thinking that he could persuade customers to come join him after the fabs were constructed. And Lip-Bu Tan does not believe that. He thinks that you should only build the fab once you have some kind of traction with customers, some kind of assurances that they're going to buy. Well, that empirically meant canceling a lot of those investments, including canceling a lot of the investment in Ohio, et cetera. Those were things that were, pretty worrisome to the U.S. government, which is thinking about, my gosh, if Intel is sort of giving up on its plans for staying at the leading edge, saying that these investments no longer make sense. What does that mean for the future of U.S. strategic dependence on Taiwan, which is very, very close to China, very far from the United States, or even Korea, which is also very close to China, very far from the United States? So you're seeing this intersection of the really formidable economics of the chip industry, the challenges of getting customers to commit to switching, which is a pretty risky thing to do and a frightening thing to do for many customers when you have like the guarantee that TSMC is going to work. And this is a big, big bet that the Trump administration is making, that getting the government involved is either a good option or the least of all the bad options, the least bad of all the available options. I think there's a lot of ways that this could go wrong, but it's a pretty remarkable development and a sea change for U.S. industrial policy.
So why would they make such a big bet? What is the administration hoping to get out of this deal?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to point out is what I said a moment ago about how the U.S. is concerned about chip manufacturing dependence on Taiwan and on East Asia more generally. Right. So if you think about OPEC, for example, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting countries. I think if you add up all the OPEC countries combined, it's something like 40% of global supply of oil. Compare that to TSMC, which has like a 99% share in AI chip manufacturing, and a 90 something, probably like a 90% share of all the chips 7 nanometers and below. Don't quote me on that second statistic, but it's really, really high. So you're talking like the strategic dependence of an industry upon which the whole economy depends. Being not just 80 miles off the coast of China, but being, the top military goal of China is reunification with Taiwan. And that's a very scary set of circumstances to be in, and one that Secretary of the Treasury Bessent said explicitly when he was talking about, why the United States needed to do this. Now, there's other ways you can imagine solving that problem, other ways that the Trump administration has been pursuing, for example, trying to persuade TSMC, Samsung, and other leading edge chip manufacturers to invest in more manufacturing capacity in the United States. This deal, it's unclear, the extent to which that's going to impact those other decisions, right? Is TSMC and Samsung, are they going to decide that because the United States government is taking an equity investment in Intel, that they need to invest more in the United States in order to sort of compete with Intel in terms of its political advantages? And you can imagine, one of the things that Intel, the biggest problems that Intel had was, as I said, and as Lit Bhutan said, the failure of the build it and they will come strategy. Intel needed not just, new fab capacity at the most advanced leading edge, but they needed customers for that capacity. And they were having a hard time persuading customers to switch over. Well, now the US government can potentially be a part of persuading customers to go with Intel. So they can be, this is just real, exerting political pressure, frankly, on customers like, you could imagine, Microsoft or Nvidia or Google or other people who are big customers of TSMC, basically saying like, hey, you need to be working with Intel because it's part of the United States' strategic goal to have more of its manufacturing of semiconductor chips take place in the United States. That's not a guarantee that that strategy will work, but I do think that it demonstrates a serious commitment towards that strategy. And commitment is part of the story. Ben Thompson, who runs the blog Stratechery, I thought he had a really good analysis, which came out on August 26th about this topic, where he said that Intel had a credibility problem, which is to say you're Nvidia and you take a big chance on Intel. You spend the billions of dollars to help Intel figure out how to manufacture your products to the degree of sophistication that you like and receive already from TSMC. Well, that's one generation, and you're making a big investment that kind of only makes sense if Intel's going to be around for a while, if they're going to be around for the next generation and the next generation. And the problem is that the economics are so formidable, it's not clear, at least it was not clear, that even if you as a customer committed to Intel for one generation, that Intel wasn't just going to get out of the business in the next generation, which is what Lit Bhutan had sort of suggested, that they might very well give up on, being a leading edge manufacturer. Keep in mind that some of Intel's best chips right now are already being made at TSMC. So that it was entirely plausible that Intel might just get out of the chip manufacturing game entirely. Well, because of the nature of how this deal is structured, the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, has described the U.S. purchase of shares as non-voting shares. That's not precisely true. There's some really important caveats to that, some important exceptions that are spelled out in the agreement. And one of those is if Intel tries to do anything that would include divesting 51% of their foundry business. So according to the terms of this deal, Intel is required to stay in the chip manufacturing game. And that provides that credibility and assurance to customers that Intel is going to stick around in this industry. That's really interesting. The other thing, and I think it's worth just saying this, even though it's not directly relevant to the question you asked, Brielle, is in terms of the other circumstances and how this deal for when the United States government votes its shares. Mm-hmm. So as I said, Howard Lutnick has described these as non-voting shares. The director of the National Economic Council at the White House, Kevin Hassett, has also said the equity is not voting, so there's not going to be any government intrusion into the business of Intel. That's not quite true either, because it says, in addition to the exception that I just mentioned, which is if Intel does anything that violates the purchase agreement or the warrants, there's also exception 3, part 2, which says, seeking to reject, disclaim, unwind, terminate, or otherwise materially and adversely impact the company or its subsidiaries' relationship with the U.S. government. So, what would qualify as materially and adversely impacting the company or its subsidiaries' relationship with the United States government? I think, selling all of their IP to China, for example, you can imagine that is something that would materially impact the relationship with the U.S. government. But there's also just like the fight that could be had with lawyers. Right. Think about the extent to which President Trump has really sought to stretch the legal interpretations of his various powers. For example, trying to fire federal officials who traditionally, had to be fired for a relatively narrowly defined set of quote unquote for cause type terminations. Well, it's possible that President Trump or a future U.S. president could have a stretched legal interpretation of what would materially and adversely impact the company or its subsidiaries' relationships with the United States government. And so I think, calling these non-voting shares is pretty generous in interpretation of what the United States is doing and what it might conceivably do in the future.
So as we do with all of these questions, policy questions, we talk about the debate that's happening about that decision. So walk me through how different groups have reacted to this deal. Let's start with the positives.
So the first thing is from technology CEOs themselves. So, for example, the Intel statement, the press release, announcing this deal, it included supporting quotes from Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, from Dell's CEO Michael Dell, from HP's CEO Enrique Lores, and Amazon Web Services AWS CEO Matt Garman. So those are big players in the cloud computing and data center market. Those are big players in the PC and laptop market, and they're all saying that they're supportive of this deal. Now, that's under the current U.S. political environment where it's pretty unusual for CEOs to try to get into a fight with President Trump. So I think you just have to acknowledge that in the context of these favorable quotes. But I think also Ben Thompson, who I mentioned before, he came out pretty strongly in favor of this, not as a guaranteed success story, but as a reasonable kind of decision to make given the geopolitical risks and just how bad the situation was facing Intel. And so here again, now I want to quote from Ben Thompson's quote, Now I want to quote from Ben Thompson's article because I thought he said something that I thought was, very reasonable. So here we go. Here's his last 2 paragraphs. Quote, "I'll be honest, there is a very good chance this won't work. Intel really is a mess. They are actively hostile to customers. No one in the industry trusts them. They prioritize the wrong things even today, i.e. technical innovation with backside power over yields for chips, which don't necessarily have interference issues. And that's without getting into the many problems with their business. Moreover, I led with Lee and Comey's argument because I agree government involvement in a private business almost always ends badly. At the same time, the China concerns are real. Intel Foundry needs a guarantee of existence to even court customers, and there really is no coming back from an exit. There won't be a startup to fill Intel's place. The US will be completely dependent on foreign companies for the most important products on Earth, and while everything may seem fine for the next 5, 10, or even 15 years, the seeds of that failure will eventually sprout, just like those 2007 seeds. And just as an aside, that's when Intel missed the boat on mobile by not winning the contract for iPhones. Just like those 2007 seeds sprouted for Intel over the last couple of years. The only difference is that the repercussions of this failure will be catastrophic, not for the US's leading semiconductor company, but for the US itself. And I think that's a pretty reasonable interpretation of what's going on here. This is a big gamble. It is, I would argue, and as Ben Thompson argues, a reasonable gamble given the geopolitical circumstances. But that's no guarantee that this is going to go well. There's a lot of very clear ways that this could go badly.
What about on the congressional side? Have we heard any commentary from either support or disagreeing with this take?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned before that the free market, traditional viewpoint of the Republican Party is pretty directly at odds with this move. And you can see that, not just in the response of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, which has always been a conservative free market type of thing. They said, I thought this was really interesting. This is a quote from their editorial op-ed. Once the government acquires a stake in Intel, the politicians will have an incentive to keep pouring on the subsidies so they wouldn't have to admit a mistake. And they go further. Step 1, subsidize a struggling business. Step 2, when subsidies aren't enough, nationalize it. Step 3, make sure it never fails. And so they're basically saying this story is going to end in worse management and then also throwing good money after bad. On the congressional side, you have folks like Rand Paul, who identifies as a libertarian, senator from Kentucky. Quote, if socialism is government owning the means of production, wouldn't the government owning part of Intel be a step towards socialism? Terrible idea.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of opposition, and it's coming mostly from conservative circles. Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont and a self-declared democratic socialist, actually, basically said, hey, this is an opportunity for U.S. citizens to get a return on investment of private companies. So he's not inherently opposed to it, which I think kind of tells you a lot, right? That this is a move that is at least consistent with many theories of socialism.
So another topic that a question we typically address when we're talking about these policy decisions is, what does this mean for the future, precedents for how we even got to this point and what it might look like for additional deals? What are your thoughts on what precedent this may have come from, or is it precedent setting moving forward?
Yeah, well, I think to begin with, what kind of precedent exists in the recent past for this kind of a move, the one that comes to mind for me is the 2008 financial crisis, when U.S. automakers were deeply, deeply troubled, and the U.S. government, in a deal that was orchestrated by President Obama, I think originally, while he was actually just the president-elect, I mean, he was doing a lot of work even as the president-elect, not even before he was president. But that was the big bailout of the automakers, especially GM and Chrysler, where the U.S. government did actually take an equity stake in those companies. But for that deal, Obama had said that this is a temporary move, that the United States does not want to get into the business of owning these companies long term, but they were buying shares to sort of shore up confidence in the companies. And they ultimately did divest the equity share that they had taken. Of course, there's a lot of foreign precedent for this type of move. If you think about companies like Airbus, those were not just industrial policy moves of European governments to create Airbus and its some of its predecessor companies, but they were also, government equity stakes in those companies. And in the case of Airbus, the investment was profitable to a major degree. More recently in the United States, there was the deal from the Department of Defense funding a rare earths magnets company. This actually just happened in mid-July. MP Materials making equity investments and loans into that. And that's, again, for geopolitical reasons because of China's dominance of rare earth minerals and magnets. So that, I think, kind of shows you that the U.S. government under the Trump administration really thinks that equity stakes matter. And NEC Director Kevin Hassett even said on CNBC, quote, "I'm sure that at some point there will be more transactions, if not in this industry, in other industries." So they are clearly of the opinion that they've set a precedent here. And then always providing the more colorful version of the story is President Trump himself. And so just to refresh everybody's memory, Lip-Bu Tan, the CEO of Intel since December 2024, had been under some pretty significant criticism, first from Senator Tom Cotton and then from Trump himself, who had accused Lip-Bu Tan of having ties to the Chinese Communist Party. So here's what Trump said after they had negotiated the deal. Quote, "He walked in wanting to keep his job and he ended up giving us $10 billion. We have a lot of deals like that. I'll do more of them." So it's not correct to say that Intel is giving the United States government $10 billion. Actually, it is the United States government that's giving Intel billions of dollars. But what is different in the Trump deal versus what had been negotiated under the CHIPS Act is that the U.S. government is acquiring equity shares instead of receiving the performance of activity milestones, such as the construction of fabs in the United States. So, yeah, it looks like this is the direction the U.S. is headed.
Well, we'll, as always, continue to follow these types of storylines on the AI Policy Podcast. But our fans will know over the last 2 episodes that we've been talking a lot about Nvidia. I do want to go back to that topic and talk about halting H20 production. So a couple of weeks ago, we discussed a new licensing deal where Nvidia agreed to pay the U.S. 15% of its revenues from H20 sales to China. But recent reports suggest that Nvidia is halting rather than ramping up H20 production. We talked a lot about sort of gaming out the scenario. So if you didn't catch those episodes, you might want to go back and listen to those. But Greg, catch us up. What has changed since last we spoke?
Yeah, so apologies to those listeners who are tired of hearing about NVIDIA and H20s. You're welcome to those who are grateful to be hearing more of this type of stuff. The problem is it just keeps being newsworthy, keeps being interesting stuff that happens. So the basic story here, which was laid out, I thought, very nicely by the Financial Times on August 21st, is that a lot of Chinese companies have either not made big purchases of H20s now that it's available again, or they have shrunk their orders. And the big question is why? Why are they doing that? And there's multiple things going on simultaneously that provide plausible interpretations for the fact pattern. The first of which is that the Chinese government is putting a lot of pressure on these companies to not buy NVIDIA. They're saying that NVIDIA could be a vehicle for backdoors, or that there could be other kinds of security concerns associated with NVIDIA chips. So the basic idea here, right, is that these chips are a vehicle for American espionage or a vehicle for American cyber attacks, and you can't trust those dirty Americans. And so you shouldn't be buying these chips. That's what the Chinese government is telling all of these big Chinese tech companies who are big purchasers of chips, whether NVIDIA or otherwise. They
started sharing that narrative immediately after the deal was announced.
They've been sharing that narrative for ages. It's the gift that keeps on giving, and it's consistent with other moves that they've made. There's restrictions on Tesla, for example, in China. And some of those are industrial policy focused. Some of those are ostensibly security focused, but are plausibly industrial policy, just in a security disguise. But like, for example, Tesla is an autonomous vehicle company. The models that go in Tesla's autonomous cars have to be trained on Chinese soil in Chinese data centers. So they say that for, cybersecurity reasons or privacy reasons. But it also, has the benefit of forcing Tesla to invest in data center capacity in China, which is conceivably an industrial policy goal that they would want to pursue. Okay, so there are these stated cybersecurity concerns. Some of them, you can imagine would be tied to bills under consideration by this Congress in the United States, which says that Nvidia, in order to prevent chip smuggling to China, needs to put tracking technologies on their chips. So that's not the same as like a cybersecurity backdoor designed to like deactivate the chips or be a vehicle for malware. And I think the fact that Congress is debating creating this kind of capability tells you that it doesn't exist already. But that's not the logic that China's, seeing in this story. They're basically saying it's evidence of America's, nefarious intent. Then there is the, promoting Chinese alternatives to Nvidia. And so as I've pointed out, the Chinese government has been more than willing to put pressure on its companies to support Chinese alternatives to Nvidia, going back to 2020 with the 352 policy that basically said you all have to get off of American chip technology within the next 3 years. So it's not like this is a deviation in policy, but it is a big move in the H20 debate because the Trump administration has been framing these H20 sales as, tied to U.S. national security by promoting Chinese dependence on American technology. Right. So you kind of have the trade-off of how much does China want to help companies like Huawei and Cambricon, which and even Alibaba, which design Chinese AI chips, but are limited by weak Chinese manufacturing capacity. So how much do you want to help companies like Huawei and SMIC in trying to become credible competitors to NVIDIA? Versus how much do you want to help Chinese AI companies like DeepSeek, Alibaba, Baidu, etc. And I think it's pretty clear that a lot of Chinese semiconductor policy is basically just written by Huawei executives. They are kind of in the driver's seat over there. And I think their preference at the moment is to do what they can to move everybody off of American chip ecosystems. My response to that is, okay. If this is, if you're committed to getting off of American technology, I'd like that to be as painful and as sudden a break as possible. I don't want to build you a comfortable bridge to walk across on your journey to an indigenous Chinese ecosystem. Okay, so that's one interpretation of the fact pattern. There is another credible interpretation of the fact pattern, and that comes from the fact that NVIDIA is currently seeking to develop a alternative chip that is part of the Blackwell generation of chips. So right. H20 is from the Hopper generation of chip technologies. Right now, NVIDIA's best chip generation is the Blackwells, which are way better than what the H20s have. So NVIDIA has been openly saying, and Trump even acknowledged that he was considering allowing NVIDIA to sell a degraded version of the Blackwell. And Trump had even floated the number of maybe a 50% performance hit to the Blackwell chips that would be sold to China. And I think the Chinese AI customers are sort of asking themselves, do we want to spend billions and billions of dollars buying H20s when it may be the case that in 30 days, if we just wait, we're going to be allowed to buy these Blackwell chips? And I think that is actually probably the truth of the matter here. Jimmy Goodrich over at Rand Corporation and a former senior executive in the Semiconductor Industry Association, he had a lovely quote that he told the Wall Street Journal. Quote, if the U.S. government were to approve a powerful Blackwell for China, even at a 30 to 50% performance reduction, my guess is we'd miraculously see China forget about security concerns. And I think that's right on the money. And Leonard Heim, also over at Rand, who had done some analysis on this point, he says that, if H20 is kind of the absolute best that you can sell under current export control performance thresholds, a 50% degraded Blackwell would be something like 12 times better than that.
Wow.
12 times better than that. 12.6x the training performance of the H20. So that's better than H100s, which, as we pointed out in this podcast, was the absolute state of the art you could buy 6 to 12 months ago. So the Blackwell generation is a really, really big performance boost. And the question is, do we want to help China, come into that, or do we not? And I think while the Chinese government and Huawei are always going to say, what you really should be doing, Alibaba, what you should really be doing, Baidu, what you should really be doing, DeepSeek, is buying Chinese chips. I think the reality is that if the Blackwell is available, those companies would be buying billions and billions of dollars worth it, and it would be helping foster a major Chinese rise in AI capabilities in the short term, and would not do anything to prevent, the Chinese government forcing everybody over to Huawei, once that's a viable option, which really depends upon Chinese domestic chip manufacturing capabilities.
So it sounds like we're diving right into a Blackwell access debate. What's the outlook for that? What's the likelihood that Nvidia can sell Blackwells to China?
So right now it's not allowed. And there has been a significant pushback in Congress, including from Republicans, on the administration's decisions to sell H20 chips to China. But President Trump, in his July press conference, I think it was July press conference, he said that Jensen Huang is coming to see him, about the Blackwells. And so that's a deal that Nvidia is going to try and strike, presumably under those same, 15% export tax terms that were negotiated for H20s. We'll see. I think it's plausible that the Trump administration will make the decision to sell, modestly degraded Blackwells. I think that would be a strategic mistake, and I hope they don't do it.
Okay, well, one thing's certain. As soon as we do find out, you will hear it on this podcast. Greg, thank you so much. Another great episode, all about chips, your favorite topic. Thank you so much for walking us through it. I think that does it for this episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Greg, thank you as always.
Yeah, thank you. And to our listeners who are looking for stuff that's not just chips, we do have some good stuff on that coming up on future episodes, so stay tuned. Thanks for listening to this episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps when you spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Sadie McCullough, and Matt Mand. See you next time.